So we're live now, and I want to welcome everybody to this weekly conversation powered by Witness to Innocent, Cruel Justice Program. Today I have a special co-host today, our Director of Development and Communication, Ms. Jennie Sheeks. She'll be joining me today, co-hosting.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. Good to see you. Thanks, Herman.
Our other special speaker today is Ngozi
Ndulue.
Ngozi. Now that you actually said it like that and with a smile, I actually called it. Ngozi. I can pronounce it now. And she's from the Death Penalty Information Center. And today we're going to have a very interesting show because it's going to reach a lot of different topics where we're going to try to get you an idea of how the past connects with the present. And we say the modern day technology hides things in a form that society overlooked the past. So we're going to begin with Jennie introducing herself. And Jennie, you can pass the mic on.
All right, well, thank you. So yeah, my name is Jennie Sheeks, and I'm the Director of Development and Communications at Witness to Innocence. And what that basically means is I get to support Herman and other amazing and awesome death row exonerees in their work to share their stories of being wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death and sent to death row for crimes that they had absolutely nothing to do with. And they use their stories to go out and really change hearts and minds about the death penalty to, statistics, which I hope we'll hear a lot of from Ngozi today, are really important. And also hearing a personal story is absolutely unforgettable. And so folks like Herman get to talking at testifying before legislatures and speaking to law students are really leaving a lasting impression on people that they can't forget. And I hope are, being a part of driving the momentum toward abolishing the death penalty in the United States. And I'm just so psyched to have the Death Penalty Information Center with us today because we really, really value DPIC's just compiling of all the facts and all the information and making it available in a really timely way. It's such a huge piece of our work. I was saying earlier to Ngozi that I'm always on their website trying to get updated information, especially about the issues of innocence and the database of exonerees. So glad to be able today to partner your amazing statistics and facts with, the personal testimony that Herman and other death row exonerees bring to this issue. So thanks for bringing me on as co-host today, Herman.
So I will do a quick introduction. So again, my name is Ngozi Ndulue. I'm Senior Director of Research and Special Projects at the Death Penalty Information Center. I come to this work from time spent working on that intersection between racial justice and the criminal legal system. So after law school, I clerked for a judge, and then I worked as a capital defense lawyer at a federal defender's office, then did broader policy and litigation work around death penalty is among issues around police issues and mostly about prisoners' rights. And then from there, I went to the NAACP, where I was their Senior Director of Criminal Justice Programs and did a lot of training and advocacy across the country. And then I came kind of home to the world of death penalty and focusing on providing that information that Jennie was talking about to folks about capital punishment. the Death Penalty Information Center focuses on education of the media, of the public, of decision makers about what is really happening with the death penalty. We don't have a specific moral stance on death penalty and death penalty abolition, but what we say is that we are there to tell the truth about the death penalty. And one of the hard truths about the death penalty is that it has always been connected to racial bias and supporting racial hierarchies in the United States. So I'm really excited to be on this program and talking about our new report that really dives into that subject.
I noticed you said that, well, I want to say that, I want to ask this question. The death penalty and a lot of these issues are addressed sometimes at the minimum by the elected officials that we have in office right now. What is your point of view on that?
Well, I think that we have seen a real change in the way that criminal justice issues and the way that the criminal legal system is addressed. So in the time of like tough on crime, let's, put as many people on death row, let's execute as many people, kind of like, late 90s was a peak for that, the death penalty was often used as a tool for that type of campaigning. I don't know that we see that as much today. We see actually movements around reform prosecutors, which is one thing that we discussed in our report, where people are getting public pressure for communities that have been affected by mass incarceration, by the effect of the criminal legal system on people of color, to actually elect people that are not going to go on this tough on crime bandwagon, but are actually going to be talking about smart on crime and are going to focus on things like the wrongful convictions of people generally and people of color in specific, and are actually going to take a proactive role in actually working for exonerations. The prosecutors who have created conviction integrity units and have been willing to recognize that mistakes, that their offices made mistakes in the past in convicting and sentencing people who were not actually guilty of that crime. So I think that elected officials have a really important role to play. And we know that kind of our narrative about crime has been very much a racialized narrative. And that played a role in the increase in the number of people in death row, the increase in the number of people serving long sentences in prisons, and also the lack of accountability for police violence. And I think that right now, communities are mobilizing to kind of hold elected officials accountable, both at the ballot box and after they've been elected, for their responsibility around these issues.
And I asked that question merely because I want viewers to understand, and I try to bring this out as much as possible. I want the viewers to understand and society to understand that change will come. And one of the most important tools to change right now is who you vote for and who you put into the office. So I wanted to bring this issue out, and I may bring it out again through the show, because I want to express how important it is for people to understand that right now we have the power to make the changes in places that we need to change, especially our criminal justice system, especially police brutality and racism. We have the power to make this change. And one of the ways we make that change is we have to actually vote the right people in, the people that is wanting change. They may not be the people that actually we agree with 100%, or we feel that they're not doing exactly what we personally want to do. But if they're doing what is right for the broad, the bigger picture to bring change, then I think that is the type of people we need in. And I thank you for your opinion on that. I wanted to, actually, I'm gonna let you have the floor to bring up the next subject.
Well, I have actually an example of what you were talking about. So Oklahoma City with the prosecution of Julius Jones, right? So there's a lot of community mobilization around his case right now. And so he was prosecuted in a jurisdiction where Cowboy Bob Macy, he ran on this idea that he was, this tough on crime, he was proud of how many people he had sent on to death row. But his term was also full of misconduct, right? And so I think we see these things hand in hand. And so now you have people in Oklahoma City where Black Lives Matter, Oklahoma City is asking and has made demands about, policing, has made demands about the criminal legal system, has also made demands about Julius Jones' death penalty case. Julius Jones is somebody who was convicted and sentenced to death in a 1999 killing of a white businessman. And he had some of the issues around race that we see in many cases across the country, right? Where the jury was, or African Americans were excluded from that jury. And also the jury, at least one of the jury members specifically used a racial slur to refer to Julius Jones. So race was kind of an undercurrent that continued to play a role in his case. And then right now, his lawyers are working on both the clemency, but also community members are kind of incorporating that in their demands for racial justice. And I think that that's important when you see the connections between those, right? So if you have, a prosecutor's office that has this history of misconduct, you have policing that has issues around misconduct. We also know that that is going to affect whether people are wrongfully convicted, and it's often going to disproportionately affect Black defendants. So we know that as far as, who is being exonerated, it's disproportionately people of color, specifically Black men. And we also know that official misconduct, it looms large in those cases. That's more likely to be a factor in the cases of the Black exonerees.
And something, I also want to point this out. We're talking about racism. And, I was listening to the radio the other day, and they was asking, how do we stop racism in our justice system? And this goes a prime example to see. Let's talk about the Julius Jones case. I'm on the campaign with the Julius Jones case with Represent Justice. Was running a big campaign out there, Miss CC and all the hard workers out there that's hitting the ground. And one of the things that people need to see as far as racism, right here is a prime example of a campaign where all races are together fighting for justice. This shows that as a community, as people in society, that we can eliminate racism when time is needed to fight for what is right, to stand up. And with that being said, changes, so many changes are coming. I mean, we went from 6,000 signers on the petition to 6 million, and it's continuous growing. And it's not just Blacks. We got the Latinos. We got everybody chipping in to pull together. Now, if we could do this into society, as in our voting, as in our working together in the community, as us standing together to make sure the police are having policies. Instead of beating the police up like they're beating us up, we need to be talking to them and trying to get them to put into policies and let them know that, hey, we're not going to have this in our community. We're going to stand up in our community. So I just wanted to point out that the Julius Jones case, and there's many other cases that's going on around the world that people are fighting for, like Curtis Floyd, Pewter's Bank, and everybody is pulling together as one. That is a sign that racism can be eliminated. So, your next issue.
Yes, I was just thinking when you said that, I think that question about kind of multiracial coalitions and multi-issue campaigns, we recognize that so much of what is going on around racial justice and injustice in the criminal legal system is tied together, right? So it's not just about, oh, you know, this you know, one racist actor in this piece, like a one racist prosecutor or judge or defense lawyer is the issue. We still have a lot of horrible examples of this in cases that, you know, are still being litigated today. So I don't want to downplay the role of kind of overt racism, but we also know that we are not administering the death penalty in a vacuum. We're administering the death penalty in a culture and a country that has been shaped by these racial hierarchies, the ideas of white supremacy, and the importance of kind of upholding those ideals. So one of the things that we do in the report is try to go back to the beginning on this. And we say, we kind of look at starting at the colonial times, where there were different crimes that you could be executed for depending upon your race. That was true in the South and slave states in particular, but you still saw in the North that there was still a disproportionate use of capital punishment and disproportionate number of executions of Black people. So, you know, like, so during, and then when you're looking at slave states, there was this idea that you had to, you know, keep the Black population in control, discourage slave rebellion. So particularly if there was some type of crime that was committed by an enslaved person against the person that legally was owning them, that they had to kind of make an example of them for the greater community. So you also saw more torturous and gruesome executions for that. But that didn't stop when slavery ended, right? At the end of, after the Civil War, there were some specifically racially distinct laws, but with the passage of the 14th Amendment and things like that, it was on paper the same, but you still saw a different application of the death penalty, depending upon the race, both of the defendant and of the victim. And so one of the things that we saw in the post-Civil War till kind of the early 20th century was this kind of lynching era, where there were a lot of lynchings, and where you were seeing basically that lynchings and the legal capital punishment system were working hand in hand. So sometimes to discourage a lynch mob, which could become a public relations problem for the local jurisdiction, because it seemed like they were a little too wild or, you know, out of control, the officials in the local court system would ensure the lynch mob that there would be a speedy execution. So the capital punishment process was being used in the same way that lynching was being used, which was allowing the kind of community, the white community, to vent their anger, and also kind of legitimizing that, not making it look too barbaric. One of the things that we have in the report is this side-by-side where you see the last public execution that happened in Kentucky, and you saw a public lynching that happened in Texas. And when you really look at those two pictures side by side, they don't look very different. So that question about when you're thinking about kind of extra legal violence, this thing that's supposedly not sanctioned, but this sanctioned death penalty, that there was very much a link, and it was very much about enforcing kind of social control and a racial hierarchy. And one of the ways that you saw that was specifically in interracial crimes. Rape was an important example where basically no one was ever, first of all, right now you can't be executed for rape without a murder. But while it was still possible, no one was ever executed for the rape of a Black woman. But it was very much about imposing that crime on Black men who were accused of raping a white woman. So there was this idea that there was this racial hierarchy that was being supported by the legal capital punishment system. Now, like I said, we have different laws right now. We have laws that, of course, everybody is supposed to be equal under the law. The same law applies to everybody, but we're having some of the same results. So even though the African American community is deeply affected by homicide and that makes up 50% of the victims of homicide, when we look at who's being executed for which crimes, 75% of the victims for people who've been executed are white. So in their study after study has shown this, that basically if the victim in a crime that someone's accused of is white, they are much more likely to be sentenced to death. They're much more likely to be executed. They're also much more likely to be innocent. That's another thing about exonerees that you see, right? Like the wrongful convictions, if the victim is white, that has a big impact upon whether somebody's going to be wrongfully convicted. So when we know that race, and particularly race of the victim, continues to have an outsized role in the death penalty, I think that makes us raises some questions about bigger picture issues and how stereotypes about Black criminality, about valuation of lives, and what we say that we're trying to do with the criminal justice system is really wrapped up in kind of our issues around race that have been long-standing.
No, one of the things I want to go to is what you said, we all supposed to be equal under the law. Yet we are so divided. I mean, each state has its own rule and law on the death penalty and the way they execute. Then we have a separate system, which is the federal system, which a lot of people don't know about the federal system. They have a totally different ball game of how they proceed and their criteria and things like that. I remember just maybe 4 years ago, Florida had never executed a white man for a Black victim. And just 4 years ago, out of all these years, that was the first time in history. Then I look at this political move that they pulled in federal when they just executed these 4 guys. And they was talking about the ties with white supremacists. The show to say, hey, we'll execute we're not racist. We'll even execute the white supremacists, you know. And it's very odd how our system that's supposed to be designed to be equal has so much division and so much, I would say, political persuasions of doing things where it benefits the politician more than it benefit the society. And the most incredible thing that I find is that here, a family that has been a victim of murder, and the person is facing the death penalty. The victim, they say they're doing it for the victim. They're seeking death for the victim. And the victim family can tell them that, hey, we don't want the death penalty. And the victim wouldn't believe in the death penalty. They wouldn't want nobody to, and so they turn around and say, well, this is our way of justice for the victim. But if the victim don't believe it and you still pressing, how do you feeling justice for the victim? And I think that it turns into an act of revenge, act of, and then if you think about it, how is it an act of revenge when the state is seeking death on a person that that the victim actually wouldn't want the death penalty? How is it act of revenge? So now we got to look at it as a political state, a political ground, and it goes to the way they have the media put this high rate of crime on and things like that. Right. The high rate of crimes in the Black neighborhood. Right. Okay. But yet, those aren't the cases that they're really seeking the death penalty. They're seeking the death penalties on the other communities, not our communities. They're giving life in prison, most of the ones in the Black community, and you're getting the death penalty for the white victims. And this is something that is so incredibly where what we stand on equal up under the law, and we're so divided.
Absolutely. There's so much to say about that. I'll start with where you ended about that issue about who is actually being victimized. So first of all, I will always take a second to mention when people talk about Black on Black crime, how that is such a problem, because most crime is intraracial, right? So Black on Black crime, nobody's talking about white on white crime, but most, that interpersonal crime is within the same race, right? So most times if somebody's being killed, a Black person's killing a Black person, a white person's killing a white person, which makes it much more stark, the figures that we have about the percentage of the victims for people who have been executed that are white, right? Because we still have, when you look at interracial crimes, and we're specifically talking Black and white, we can also talk about Latinx people and what we know about that, and there's still disparities there. But specifically for Black and white crime, if you look at people where the victims were of just one race, there have been 295 people, Black people, executed for killing a white person. There have been 21 white people executed in the modern era for killing a Black person. So we know that even though most crime is intraracial, most homicides are intraracial, there is something that is going on with the way that we're treating Black people who are charged with the death of white people, and even who gets charged changed, right? Because the question of which homicides are cleared with an arrest, you're much more likely to have a homicide that's cleared by an arrest if the victim is white, right? So in cases of murders of Black victims, you're actually less likely to have a case at all. So we know that those questions about interracial crimes really show something about the way that we approach race and about our society's issues with race. Some other facts about that are that there's a Philadelphia study that was really powerful, and it looked at people who had been sentenced to death, and it gave people pictures. And so the people in the study had to rate the pictures for how kind of stereotypically Black they looked. So if they had darker skin, if they had broader lips, if they had broader noses, that would be, you would be on one side of the scale. Lighter skin, thinner nose, thinner lips, you'd be on a different side of the scale. What they found was that for those defendants, so all these Black defendants in Philadelphia, if the victim was Black, their appearance didn't really make a difference. But if the victim was white, they were much more likely to be sentenced to death if they had darker skin, fuller lips, broader nose, right? So there was this idea that there's something in the back of our heads about race and punishment. And we've also seen some other studies that show that. So there's a recent study about retribution, and that there's this whole science around implicit bias and unconscious bias. And so the researchers were looking at unconscious bias around punishment and retribution and that revenge that you were talking about. And that there's this unconscious bias that connects Black people with revenge and white people with mercy. And that the people who had the more anti-Black implicit bias were more willing to say that the point of criminal justice is retribution. They believed more strongly in retribution as the reason that our criminal justice system exists. So what does this mean? We know that when we're talking about death penalty cases, juries have a real big role, right? They are the ones making the life and death decision, absent some strange jury override issues in some states. But they're the ones making this life or death decision, and have been for everybody who's on death row. But we know these things are operating in the background. We also know that the death qualification system makes it so that people who, are strongly against the death penalty, cannot fairly impose the death penalty, are excluded from juries completely, which means that you both have a wider jury. You also have a jury that is more skewed towards conviction, which is also going to affect whether there are wrongful convictions. And you're going to have a jury that's, skewed towards that kind of punishment. So much of this is a factor throughout the criminal legal system, and especially when you have that enormous power in juries. But judges are not excluded from this. Judges still have the same implicit biases, and we have very powerful examples of problems with judges specifically around race. And the last thing is the federal government and federal executions. I think it's important to recognize that the federal government is, another jurisdiction. So just like a state, Oklahoma is a jurisdiction, Florida is a jurisdiction with death row. The federal government is basically putting itself into this outlier jurisdiction category, right? Where, we're near historic lows in death sentences and executions. The federal government has just gone forth and tried to, execute a number of people in the middle of a pandemic, putting a lot of people at risk. And we know that race is also a factor when we look at federal death sentences. So I want to make sure that we don't put the federal death penalty on some unnecessary pedestal, because the same problems that we see in jurisdictions with issues of race, issues of wrongful death sentences in different states, we see it at the federal level too. We also see that personality-driven prosecution that we talk about in our report, how the person who gets to decide, who has that discretion, is this prosecutor who can make decisions that are very much about them and not necessarily about the pursuit of justice. And I think we can see the results of that.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here with like a comment and question too on all of that, because the whole concept of implicit bias was like going through my mind right when you were saying that. And I think that one of the things I've learned in this is about the sentencing phase of capital cases. And I've learned this from Herman and the other exonerees, because I don't have a legal background, but that there's this whole process of arguing mitigating factors and aggravating factors. So things about the defendant's life, the mitigating factors being things about their life that would make you feel sympathy for them and have mercy toward them and say, okay, I can understand how this would happen, and you don't deserve to die for it, right? And then the aggravating factors being things about the horrificness of the crime, or maybe the need for retribution and revenge, right? That bring up, okay, you do deserve to die for this, being that process. And I don't know if that aggravating factor, mitigating factor is a thing in other types of cases, or if that's unique to capital cases. But I feel like that is so ripe for being completely saturated in implicit bias. And so any comments on that? I'll just share really quickly that I did have a dear friend who was executed in 2001, and his case was one where it was a Black man who killed a white woman, right? And so it just totally fits into the patterns that we're seeing of how racism affects it. But I also feel like it had to fit into this issue of mitigating factors and aggravating factors, right? Because he was a young man with substance abuse issues and mental health problems, and he lived with his grandmother. And in the weeks before he committed this murder, his grandmother took him to a psychiatric hospital, and they asked for help. He said, "I'm not feeling right. I'm not myself. I need help." And they said, "You have the wrong health insurance," and sent him home. Right. And then he wakes up out of a blackout, having committed a crime against his elderly neighbor who he had there was no reason for this crime at all. Right. Other than his own illness, which he sought help for. So I think, if the races of defendant and victim had been swapped, with that as his background and his story, and maybe with some, adequate legal representation, which is another issue of, racism, and also, how poverty gets into this, right? But that there's no way that wouldn't have been a mitigating factor that could have gotten him life rather than executed. And so can you speak to that a little bit, the mitigating and aggravating?
Absolutely. And I would say that in the death penalty case, those specific factors are generally in front of a jury. And I think that is what makes it different. In most other criminal cases, that's the judge who's going to be deciding kind of sentencing factors, and they might have some guidelines that are advisory or not. It depends on the state. But this part of deciding, basically the Supreme Court has told us that this is a punishment that's supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst. So we're trying to figure out, is this the worst of the worst case? Is this the worst of the worst person? And so to do that, you're supposed to have this individualized decision-making about, like you said, these aggravating and mitigating factors. What we find, though, is that this isn't, again, we're not kind of in a value neutral space, right? Our issues as a society come out in courtrooms just like they come out in boardrooms, just like they come out on the street. So one thing about this is that kind of on the aggravation side, this idea of future dangerousness, which is not always a specific thing that juries are supposed to find. In some cases, like Texas, it's very explicitly the jury has to make some type of determination about whether the person is going to be a future danger. But regardless, it's something that is in the back of jurors' minds when they're trying to make the sentencing decision. If we think about the way that kind of stereotypes about kind of Black criminality are affecting that, that also ties into all the issues that we have about police violence, about that presumption of danger that can put Black people's lives in danger in that scenario. It also makes us think about stand your ground and the way that like private citizens, when they say, "Oh, I was afraid for my life," well, what did they do? But it was just, there's this idea in the background, that Black people, Black men in particular, are scary, right? I think about Terrence Crutcher, who's from the helicopter, the officer was talking about who's a big bad dude or a bad dude just by looking at him, right? So that idea that is either at the forefront of the mind when jurors have to make a decision about future dangerousness, or at the back of their mind when they're just thinking about, is this the worst of the worst, we know has baggage. And we can think about that kind of implicit bias. We can think about overt bias that could come in at that stage. And then also when we're thinking about that mitigation factor, when I talk about implicit bias kind of in a general context, I think about, who do you give the benefit of the doubt? Who do you think has potential, especially when you're thinking about potential for rehabilitation, potential for the rest of their life? Because really jurors are making a decision about kind of whether a person is redeemable. And we know that our implicit biases are going to have an effect on that. And then there are really practical things about whether you have a lawyer who's willing to tell a story that about the person's life and about who they are that jurors can relate to. We know that one, race can be a barrier to that empathy, to creating that empathy for the defendant when you're trying to kind of convince jurors to not choose death, but to choose life there. And then I'll circle back to what I said earlier about the race of victim. There are, so a consistent finding among studies across the country around race is that race of victim is a crucial factor. And some of the researchers have said it basically acts as an additional aggravating factor. Like, if you are just trying to look at death sentences and you're going to try to look at them neutrally, there's no way to explain why the killing of white victim is more likely to get you the death penalty. But it almost acts as, you know, an official aggravating factor. If you actually put it in like that, it actually explains the death sentencing and death sentencing rates, and different jurisdictions have done this. One of the most recent studies went back to look at defendants that were part of a really kind of groundbreaking study in the 80s about the way Georgia was imposing the death penalty. And that study done by David Baldus showed that there was a significant difference between whether you would be sentenced to death or not based on the race of your victim. And that was the study that was used in McCleskey versus Kemp, where the Supreme Court said, even if that's the case, sorry, that's not enough to make a constitutional challenge. So just last year, researchers went back and looked at those defendants over time, and they found that the effect of race of victim got even more extreme as you went longer over time across capital cases. So there was a 17 times higher execution rate for those whose victims were white. So when we know this, we know some of why that is, and we also know that it's connected to so many things that we need to be addressing in societal issues. But there's also this point where you say, okay, so you know, that was 1987, McCleskey versus Kemp. So we had some significant and persuasive evidence of the effect of race of victim on death penalty cases. The Supreme Court said, sorry, you're out of luck. That's not working. We have mountains and mountains of more evidence by now, and we're still doing the same thing around the death penalty. You really have to ask, if this is supposed to be the most extreme, the harshest punishment, and we have so much evidence that it's a racially biased and it's being administered in a racially biased way, how can we call our system a criminal justice system and allow that to continue?
One of the things, I mean, it's a couple of things I want to touch on, but one of the things I want to talk about, a secret, what I consider from a secret tool that the state used as an aggravator. And one of those things is the media. When you got the cases coming in as a high profile case, or you got a lot of media coverage on it, and that again goes to who the victim is actually tied into. Is it a political person? Is it a police officer? Or you know, and things like that. You know, they use the media to make these cases so high profile. And when you get into the actual trial and the jury, majority of the jury people that they pick, it's like just like the old days when they used to get ready to do the hanging, they choose which neighbor they're gonna pull on the jury. And today they use a modern day system to ask questions to see which ones they want to pull on the jury for this. And a lot of them all actually have already seen the news. Even though they ask that they see the news, some say, I'm not sure or whatever, because it's been so long ago that it actually happened, but then they recollect that they did see it. Once they go to handling the case, and some be so excited to be on the case because they done seen it on the news, and they're manipulated that way to actually make this case aggravated, because they don't know if that defendant over there is the actual one. But because the media is spreading out so much like it is, you know, they say that's the one. So now the media done said how gruesome the murder was, the murder scene was, this and that, and that plays as an aggravator, because if the person has seen it on the news and they see this person here been broadcast over the news as a person that got it and how bad the crime was, when it wasn't really that bad, it was like a normal murder that happens. The guy went in and shot his wife, you know, or something like that. And it's amazing how they use these type of tools, such as the media, to as an aggravator. And they use the questionnaire to pick the neighbors they want on the jurors to decide this case, because they know that neighbor will agree with them to do the death penalty. You know, it's the way you look at the system, and all this can change by the jurors. I mean, look at the Curtis Flowers case we have going on right now with the Mississippi case, 6 trials. And all was where the blacks was on the jury. You know, 6 trials, 2 mistrials, 8 times. And it wasn't of his peers. It wasn't the blacks that was there. It was the whites, and it was picked through a system that which neighbor I want to put on here to vote on this jury, you know, because if you look at it, if you actually look at it, our justice system has never wrongfully convicted anyone or sentenced anyone to the death penalty. It's always been the jury. Just like she said before, the jury recommends death. The jury is the one that finds the guilty. That's how come we got exonerations now. That's why we got so many people, innocent people, that has been executed. Yes, I'm going to say that. They has been executed. Whether we want to talk about the modern day executions or we want to talk about the executions back in the 30s, the 20s, the 10s, the 1800s. They have been using this system for years to kill innocent people just to close a case, to make them to appeal to the community as if they did their job, they got their mind, they man, like Hawaii 5-0, they get their man. And when in reality, if you look at all these exonerations that's coming up and about, and most of them are from 20, 30 years ago, it shows that this system that we are severely supposed to have changed from the early centuries to now is still in effect. It's still in effect. It's just being sugarcoated. And it's being manipulated through the media, through the jurors. Half of them don't want to sit on the trial. They don't realize the importance. Half of them don't even know what a reasonable doubt is. And one other thing, and I'm gonna give it back to you, is I want to point out to what you said about in that courtroom, in that closing statement. It's all about which ones give the best story in the most convincing way that the jury is going to take. And that's the bottom line. Half of the jury don't know what reasonable doubt is. Half of them ain't paying attention to the burden of proof that the state must prove. They don't know what the burden of proof is. But because the state attorney is the state attorney, and the police officers are the police officers, they don't testify who's sworn to withhold justice, that the police officers can't lie, and the police officers do good work. They got all this technology. They pinpointed this man. This is who did it, and that'd be the bottom line.
I think a good example of that, when we're talking about kind of that story that is being presented to the jury, is Payne's case, right? Purvis Payne is on Tennessee's death row, has a execution date coming up, and he was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of a white woman and her child. And this was a neighbor, and the story that the prosecution gave was that he was high on drugs, that he was out looking for sex. They kind of emphasized the fact that she's a white woman. So there's this, again, this pattern, this story that they were trying to fit it into, which there really wasn't evidence of. And then you have all this, you know, shenanigans going on with the DNA and the evidence in the case, and you know, things that have not been tested, and that they're working on testing. But that issue about kind of what are the stories that are being used to convict folks, what are the stories that jurors are willing to believe, and we see those issues. We also see about who, as you were saying, about who ends up on juries. That question about death qualification can really affect who is on a capital jury. We know that disproportionately affects people of color. Well, we also know that even just excuses for so there are excuses for cause, which means that there's a legal reason that this person cannot serve on the jury. That death qualification process, whether they can you know, fairly impose a death sentence, is one of them. But there are other excuses for cause. Excuses for cause can also unfairly exclude jurors of color, because there are some questions about people's experience with the criminal legal system that can be used to exclude folks. And then if they're not successful with excusing people for cause, they can use what are called peremptory strikes. And that's what Curtis Flowers, district attorney, used in his many trials. Thankfully, finally, the district attorney's office said that they would not be prosecuting him again after 6 whole trials and many reversals. And mistrials. So then you can use, and for peremptory strikes, you're supposed to be allowed to use any reason as long as it's not a discriminatory reason. And there are so many excuses that have been raised for excluding jurors of color that there's just such a big loophole that allows prosecutors to do that. We know that there have been recent attempts to change that. So California just passed legislation to try to change the way that peremptory strikes are used and make sure that it can't be used for discrimination. The state of Washington also changed their rule about how jury selection happens, and making sure that there's also education about bias in jury selection. So there are steps that people are taking to try to make this process fair, but we're seeing at every single stage of capital cases where race can really have a big impact on who gets sentenced to death and who gets eventually executed. As you said about people who've been exonerated, we know that that there's a disproportionately large number of African Americans who have been found to be wrongfully convicted, and particularly in death penalty cases, we know that about 20% of the exonerations in death penalty cases resulted from or involved official misconduct, prosecutor or police misconduct. And so these are all connected. All these movements for justice are really connected.
You know, something that we're overlooking in Payne cases are probably an example where it's a child involved. And sometimes it feels, members of the jury may feel that they have to convict that person because the child that was involved, the child was murdered, an innocent child was murdered. So there, you know, sometimes, as I was saying before, it's more where the media hyped it up so much to where the jury feel like a child is involved and looks across that room and see Mr. Payne sitting there, and they like, how can you do this? You know, you look, and all these questions in their mind because a child is involved, and that blinds them from actually seeing and listening to the evidence presented and what the state attorney and what the defense attorneys are saying. And, you know, I sympathize for the child being involved, but it's also a duty of the jury to overlook that particular point, to focus on the evidence presented to ensure that this man is the one that actually committed this crime. And he's in a state where, I mean, racism played a big part over there, you know, in their justice system. And it's, you know, it's terrible how some of the politicians is over there with the good old boy system. But again, it's so many things that plays a part of actually helping the state as a secret, as what I call a secret aggravator. The fact that the child was involved is an aggravator before they even got to the penalty phase to decide whether it's a death penalty or life in prison. You know, it was used in the very trial, you know, to find him guilty, you know, because they don't want to say we let him go or he didn't do this, and it was a child involved. There's so many cases where you see when kids are involved, it's no shot. But I've known many exonerations that came about where when they actually did the DNA, the person wasn't even nowhere around. And it wasn't the evidence there to even convict this person of it. So that shows that the point that a child was involved played a part of the jury not focusing on the evidence and wrongfully convicting someone. And my question to you, I know this may be a difficult question, but do you believe that when circumstances such as a child is involved, cases are handled much different than a normal murder case? Because I've seen in a lot of cases, the judge themselves deny a lot of motions that should be granted just because a child was involved. And they'll speak out, hey, you killed the child in courtroom before the person even been found guilty. Do you believe that because a child is involved, that it aggravates the case to say society view or could damage the outcome of it?
I do think that this ties into what you were talking about before about kind of the identity of the victim and how that affects all factors, all stages of a case. So depending on who the victim is, it makes it more, there's more pressure to solve the case, you know, get an arrest, charge somebody, and to sentence them to death. So we've talked about this in the way that kind of race affects that, but I do think also with child victims, right? You know, that tears at our heartstrings. We know that it's horrific when a child has been killed. So I think that when folks have pressure to make sure that they have solved this, both kind of external and internally, I think that that is always going to play a role in the way that they approach this. And then you kind of, when you add in those questions about kind of police misconduct, prosecutor misconduct, hiding evidence and things like that, where you can see how for people who are just very motivated to kind of get their person and close that case, how that can all kind of snowball, right, into you know, hiding evidence, to pressuring somebody to make a statement, all those things, to kind of finding who's on your radar as a likely person. I definitely see how that combines. And I think that that's our question. When we know that in our system of justice, there are many ways that there is this ability to kind of allow somebody to wrongfully be convicted, wrongfully be sentenced to death and executed, what do we have to do to ensure that justice is truly served? And I think that we have a lot of work to do on that case.
Well, we're running out of time here. This hour went so fast. Sometimes I'll be sitting here looking at the clock and it's over with. But actually, I want to continue going on this because it's very interesting. It's getting to the heart of things, and I really love it. But I have to bring it up to an end. My staff got things to do. I'm sure you probably have something to do, but I would like for us to do another show together, because I really like the way we're getting the information out, and that the information that you have, I think that this should be repeated. So I guess Chloe just took over the screen. So I'm going to talk about a couple of links. Actually, Jennie, you want to talk about the links? Do you see the links?
Sure. Am I muted, or can y'all can hear me? Okay. No, I'm with you, Herman. I could go on and on. I want to keep going here, but I would like us to sort of end on, we were talking a lot about Purvis's case and the implicit bias in all of this. And I just want to say, like, I'm thinking a question we've had is, are people who are innocent on death row more likely to be killed, more likely to be executed rather than exonerated? Are people of color, are Black people who are innocent on death row more likely to be executed rather than being exonerated? And it's a question that's hard to answer. But if we take this implicit bias issue and look at it, the same implicit bias that can make juries see the aggravating factors and not see the mitigating factors, I feel like has to come up in the exoneration phase as well, right? So Purvis, there was some circumstantial evidence, placing him at the scene that painted a picture during his trial that got him sentenced to death, right? But now here his attorneys are presenting this alternate, view of what happened there and saying, listen, he happened upon this crime and tried to help out of the goodness of his heart. He was trying to help. And so there was a little bit of blood on him that was used to say, okay, you're the one who had to have committed this crime. When really, when you look at all of that actual forensic evidence, it doesn't match up to him being the perpetrator. It actually matches up to his story that he's saying all along, of that he found the victims and was trying to help. And if he were a white defendant and the victims were people of color, would the people who are now hearing his clemency petition say, yeah, you know what, I believe it. I believe that he was really there to help and that they got it wrong at his trial, right? I just think race has to play a role in all of this, and it makes it a compounded injustice. But I'll do what Herman asked me to do and say, okay, if you have questions for Herman, here is his email, hlindsey@witnessdeinnocence.org. The new race report from the Death Penalty Information Center that we did not get to hear enough about today, and so we have to have another show. That little bit.ly will get you there, but you can also go to the Death Penalty Information Center's website, deathpenaltyinfo.org, and find the report there very easily. Please learn more about the innocence cases of people who are on death row right now, who have very strong claims of innocence, one of which is Julius Jones, who we mentioned. justiceforjulius.com is the website. A very urgent one right now is Purvis Payne. You can go to purvispayne.org or the innocenceproject.org, just innocenceproject.org, because he has an execution date in December. So we really need to take action on his case. Next week, if you turn in for this show, Cruel Justice, Thursdays at 3 Eastern, Herman is going to be speaking with the family of Rodney Reed. So with Ioana Akpan and also with Roderick Reed, who are Rodney's family members, to hear more about what's going on in his case as well. And, always please support the work of Witness Innocence. Go to our website /donate. You could also host an exoneree speaker on Zoom for your college, your congregation, your community group. And you can also go to a forum on our website, host a speaker. And finally, the last link there is our Accuracy and Justice program, working with prosecutors, those those district attorneys and prosecutors who are trying to change things around, they can have witness to innocence, death row exonerees come and tell their stories and talk about, what can we do to change things at that phase of the trial to prevent these wrongful death sentences. So I'll turn it back over to Herman for the final goodbye. And thank you, Ngozi, so much for joining us. It's just been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I could talk about this forever, so I'm happy to talk about more too. Thank you, Herman.
So we're sure you're volunteering for another show, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I would love to, Jennie, if we can make it possible. I'm gonna draft Mark Elliott at FABP to be on the show with me and Ngozi to do this. And I want to send a shout out to FABP Floridians Against for Alternative for the death penalty. They gave us great support in getting this message broadcast out every week. They support our show by actually emailing and broadcasting the event.
Let me jump in here. I forgot, we have to mention that tomorrow is Wrongful Conviction Day. So please, everyone, look online, try to find information about Wrongful Conviction Day. It's an important day to raise awareness about wrongful convictions.
Wrongful Conviction Day. I'm glad I don't have to tell my story, because that is a day for me that it's good, it's good, but it's kind of depressing for me, because it's like, here it is, it's so many more in those walls that are innocent and don't deserve what happened to them, and there's so many more on death row don't meet the qualification as the worst of the worst. And that is a day we have to sit there and think about those people, a wrongful conviction. And I think that I want to thank all of the attorneys out there and all the state attorneys and judges that's out there that's actually making these exonerations happen. Always, one thing I try not to do is blast anyone. And I always give people credit when needed. And right now, we do need to give those that's working behind the scenes on these cases so hard to get Mr. Payne out, Mr. Jones out, Rodney Reed case, all these cases that's hidden in the media, and all those cases that's not in the media. It's so important for us to give a shout out and thank those attorneys, and including state attorneys, because what you don't know, a lot of state attorneys are trying to work to help free some of these people. We have some politicians that are actually helping out on these cases, and I want to thank all of them for that. I want to thank my staff at Witness the Innocent. I want to thank my executive director, Kurt Blusberg, chairman of the board, Quinn, and our great board of directors. I want to thank Jennie for volunteering to co-host. I think I'm going to have that every week. I think we're going to have that every week. No, you shaking your head, no, but I'll probably have that every week, because it's like you add the professionalness to it. I be trying to be the realist, but you add the professionalness to it. So, so yeah, let your hair down.
All right. I'll bring the professionalism back in to say it's 4:13. We got to end the show.
Okay. We're done. So, as Jennie said, we have to go. So I thank everybody for tuning in to this week Crew Justice Show, and I thank our special guests and DPIC for the great information. So till next week, join us 3 o'clock Thursday. And please, one last thing, share the video on your Facebook. share your video on the Facebook. It may not be something you may be interested in or may not, but somebody can learn from this. So share the video on your Facebook. Thank you.